In the 5th century, a man named Simeon Stylites climbed onto a pillar in the Syrian desert and stayed there for 37 years. Crowds gathered, emperors wrote him letters. He was one of the most famous people in the late Roman world. Asceticism, practices of self-denial and discipline for spiritual purposes, had produced a genuine celebrity. But Simeon's tradition didn't build anything that lasted. The movement that shaped Europe, that preserved its books, cultivated its land, and anchored its spiritual life for 600 years, was founded on something far less dramatic: moderation. Before Benedict, the Christian world overflowed with spiritual athletes. Desert Hermits in Egypt lived alone in caves, fasting for days. Simeon Stylites perched on his pillar, exposed to sun and rain. Irish monks built beehive huts on Skellig Michael, a jagged rock in the North Atlantic battered by storms. These figures were celebrities of self-denial, and their appeal was enormous. But here's the problem. These traditions depended on extraordinary individuals. Each extreme ascetic was by definition unique. You can't franchise a pillar, you can't scale a hermit. Extreme holiness doesn't replicate. Before we can understand the rule, we need to understand what monks are and what they're not. Both monks and priests are clergy, professional members of the church distinct from the laity, ordinary believers, but priests interact with the laity. They perform sacraments, sacred rituals like baptism, confession, and last rites. They're intermediaries between the divine and the material world. Monks do something different. They withdraw from the world entirely, living lives of contemplation and self-denial in close communities. That distinction matters. The rule regulates a sealed community, not a parish. So if monks withdraw from the world, how do you organize an entire community of them? That's what Benedict of Nursia set out to answer in the late 6th century. His rule is a manual, a practical handbook for setting up and running a monastery. It covers everything: how many hours to pray, when to eat, how to handle discipline. And its genius is a single design principle: moderation. The rule is ascetic but not extreme. Monks pray, fast, and live simply, but they're not starving on pillars or freezing on islands. They sleep in beds, they eat meals, they live together in structured communities led by an abbot, the head of the monastery, to whom every monk owes obedience. This moderation is the key to scalability. A system that demands superhuman endurance can only exist where superhuman individuals happen to appear. A system that demands consistent, reasonable discipline can be replicated anywhere. By the early medieval period, thousands of monasteries across Western Europe followed this single rule. It dominated until the 12th century. But moderation alone doesn't explain the rule's power. The real innovation is what monks were asked to renounce: not food, not shelter, not comfort, something harder to give up than any of those: their own will. Benedictine asceticism is almost the opposite of hermit or pillar saint monasticism. The ascetic act is not dramatic individual deprivation. It's the constant daily subordination of your personal will to the community's rhythms and the abbot's authority. You eat when the community eats. You pray when the community prays. You walk when the community walks. Obedience is not just a management tool, it is the penance. Every hour of every day, the monk practices self-denial, not through spectacular suffering, but through quiet compliance. And here's the trap Benedict understood: any pride in your own spiritual accomplishments, feeling good about how humble you are, is itself a spiritual failure. Benedict's heavy emphasis on humility addresses precisely this paradox. The monk must abandon everything, including self-satisfaction. This is asceticism turned inward, aimed at the ego itself. There's a second revolution buried in the rule, one that would have shocked any Roman aristocrat. In the Roman world, the ideal was otium cum dignitate, leisure with dignity. Physical labor was degrading. A gentleman read, sought, and contemplated. Servants and slaves did the work. Even Augustine, before his conversion, aspired to this life of cultured ease. The Roman elite defined their status by what they didn't do with their hands. Labor belonged to the lower orders. Dignity meant freedom from toil. Benedict broke with this tradition radically. Monks must work with their hands. For upper-class monks, and many were from aristocratic families, this was itself an act of humility. Labor served two purposes. It was penitential, a form of spiritual discipline, and it was practical, making monasteries economically self-sustaining. Then there's section 48 of the rule, which discusses labor and sacred reading. Copying manuscripts and studying texts are implicitly treated as forms of labor. This is the seed that grew into monasteries, becoming Europe's great centers of learning and book preservation. But Benedict himself didn't explicitly develop that idea. It was an emerging consequence, not a stated goal. So what happens when you combine a moderate rule, communal obedience, and a culture of labor? You get something unprecedented, a franchise manual for spiritual communities. The rule tells you how to pray, eat, work, and discipline, all in a way that any community of reasonably committed people can follow. You don't need a spiritual superhero. You need a good system. Look at the map. From the 6th to the 12th century, Benedictine monasteries spread across Western Europe, Italy, France, Germany, England, Spain. Thousands of communities, all following one rule. Monte Cassino, Benedict's original monastery in central Italy, was the origin point. From there, the model radiated outward. Each monastery was self-sustaining. Each followed the same daily rhythms. Each produced the same combination of prayer, labor, and obedience. These weren't just spiritual communities. They became Europe's centers of agriculture, clearing and cultivating land across the continent. They became Europe's centers of learning, copying, and preserving the manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost. They became anchors of stability in a fragmented post-Roman world. Extreme traditions produce saints. Moderate traditions produce institutions. The most successful monastic movement in European history wasn't built by the most extreme monks. It was built by the most moderate ones, not spiritual superheroes, just a good system, followed consistently for 600 years.